Hello, everyone, and welcome to this BA Collab Hour webinar. Bad weather doesn't have to mean bad business. Let Enzymes help. My name is Joe Damgard. I'm the Sales Activation Manager here at the Brewers Association. Before we get started for today, just a couple of things I'd like to go over. First off, if you have any questions during today's presentation, please be sure to use the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of your screen. You could certainly chat amongst yourselves in the chat on the side of the screen, but we ask that you place any questions there. You can vote up any questions that you're also interested in hearing the response to, just so the most popular ones float to the top. We'll get to those shortly after we wrap up the presentation today. If you have any connectivity issues during today's presentation, first thing to try is a quick refresh. If that doesn't help, shoot us a message in the chat and someone from the BA will help you troubleshoot your issues there. Last but not least, this presentation is being recorded today. It will be available at this very same link shortly after we wrap up, and will be archived on the Brewers Association website. The presentation deck from today is also available at that green button at the bottom of your screen, the presentation PDF, if you'd like to download those slides and follow along on your side. That's about it for me. I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to the speaker for today, Alexander Mertz. He's a brewing engineer at Enzymes. Alex, go ahead and take us away.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for joining the session today. So as mentioned, my name is Alexander Mertz. I'm a brewing engineer working for Enzymes since 8 years, but I'm in the brewing industry for a longer time, so I've working for other companies, flavor companies before. I'm located in Europe, specifically in Switzerland, where I'm working from, but I'm originally from Germany, where I live as well. So that brings me to the link. If you start to get interested in enzymes and what enzymes can do to you, and you're looking where you can reach out to, I have colleagues in North America, which would be Dillick Austin, where you can see the email address up here. And also, if you're from Europe or you want to reach out to my colleagues in Europe, there's Alexander Sonne, located in Denmark, for further support. Yes, well, as to me, so I've been working 8 years in Enzymes. I'm a brewing engineer. I'm employed as a industry technology specialist in Enzymes. That means I'm going to the breweries and support the enzyme, implementation of enzymes in the brewery. And I've gathered a lot of experience over the last few years. That's also reflected in this presentation. So how to deal, in this specific topic, how to deal with bad weather and what enzymes can do to you. So let's start. Maybe a quick introduction to Novozymes. So Novozymes is the largest global biotechnology company, and we are headquartered in Balsvær in Denmark. Just over here. That's where we have our headquarters, our R&D, some production, but we are actually located all over the world. So we have production facilities in North America, South America, in Asia. We have offices all around the world as well, also development. So there's always an office close to you if you're interested to get in contact. We are working in a lot of different industries, I would say. That's shown to you on the right side of the screen, and we are divided in 2 divisions. One is what we call consumer biosolutions, and that's everything that's kind of getting directly in contact with the final consumers. So probably most known to you, of course, is brewing or other beverages like wine and also fruit juices, but then everything that's related to the dairy industry, so milk and cheese, bread, in the baking industry, but then also detergents. So if it's for your dishwasher, if it's for your clothes, if it's medical cleaning, that's what we kind of have gathered in our consumer biosolutions division. And then we have also agriculture and industrial biosolutions. So that's what's, I would say, classical B2B business, where we are focusing on things like bioethanol, oils and fats, starch, distilling, and so on. So these big industries. For the agenda today, first of all, I'm not quite sure how you are known to enzymes and what enzymes actually can do to you and what enzymes are. So we'll give you a quick introduction to what enzymes are and how we produce enzymes. And then we'll have a specific look in the brewing industry. So how enzyme are used in the brewing industry and have been used in the brewing industry. Afterwards, we'll look on the specific topic on bad weather and how enzymes can assist you in working with low quality barley and malt that you might get or I've seen over the last few years. And lastly, we'll also have a look at I would say topic that's around all the media and that's the energy costs and what enzymes can do for you to save some costs here, or see it the other way around, what you can do also to make your mark on the sustainability targets that are out there in the world. Starting what enzymes are. So enzymes are proteins. So it's something organic, and it can be found in nature. So you will find enzymes pretty much everywhere. You will find it in the beer you're making from the malt. You will find it in your body, in every single cell. You will find it in every living matter, you can say. So in plants, you will find it in animals and so on. And what enzymes do is they drive chemical reactions by breaking down complex structures. So they are catalyzing specific chemical reactions to make it faster to happen and to get a controlled, you could say, outcome of this chemical reaction. As opposite, we are also working with microorganisms, and microorganisms are living organisms. So it means you have a living organism, and a living organism has a lot of proteins, so enzymes, for example. So the organism, the microorganism, is something much bigger. And there are many millions different organisms out there in the world, and every organism has kind of its specific capabilities in dealing with nature. That means we kind of, our scientists go out there and search for the best organisms that could help us generate the enzymes we need for every specific industry. That sounds quite complex, but just imagine you want to have an alpha amylase that is broken down, that breaks down starch at higher temperatures. So that would mean you would look for an organism who is living at conditions where high temperatures exist, and you would look if there's an organism, if there's an organism, and if it contains alpha amylases that can be used to produce in industrial scale, so it can be used in other industries as well. And what this enzyme might be doing, or what they would be catalyzing, I have a few examples on the right side. So if you, for example, want to have cleaner clothes, you can use enzymes to get the stains off your clothes, for example, protein stains, or if it's starch stains, or is it fat stains at lower temperatures. So you do not need to go up as high in temperature as in the past when you did your laundry, like 50, 60 degrees. Nowadays, you can run everything at 20 to 30 degrees with even better results and a less negative impact on the clothes and environment as before. Enzymes can give you better nutrition. So you can generate, or you get more out of your food, so you're generating less waste because you're breaking down molecular structures that would not be broken down just by itself. We are making a change by green fuel, so by reducing dependency on oil by using, for example, bioethanol. And another possibility is getting higher yields by using fewer pesticides, because we're using microorganisms that kind of protecting, for example, the yield on your field. The way we produce enzymes is, as mentioned before, we're looking for the right organism. That can be in nature, but it can also be looking in the lab, how we can modify the organism and start the fermentation of it. So it's pretty much the same as what you see in the brewery. So you have a big fermentation tank, you give the raw materials, you give the microorganism, and then you start the fermentation. After it has started, you start a purification process. So you're only looking for one specific enzyme in this case. And since all proteins have different particle sizes and molecular sizes, you can specifically kind of filter out the one you want to get out. Afterwards, we have the formulation, so you can either have a liquid product or a granulated product. In the brewing industry, you usually work with a liquid product because it's easier to dose and to use. Whereas, for example, if you look at detergents, it's usually a granulated product. If you look at I mentioned before that enzymes work at specific conditions. So, for example, if you have a microorganism living at hot wells, you will find enzymes that work at hot temperatures. And every enzyme is working at other conditions, and you can differentiate between universal factors where it's working, like a certain pH range, a certain temperature range, and of course a specific time and enzyme dosage. But then you have also situational factors that you can also directly influence. That's the amount of solids, the oxygen level, stabilizers, inhibitors, and also the water quality. To give you kind of an example is if you look to the right side, there you see the impact, for example, of the pH level on the what we call relative activity of the enzyme. So you can see by the graph that the enzyme is working at 5.2, a pH of 5.2, but it's not as good working as, for example, at the pH of 5.3 to 5.5. And that's what I hope. And that's what we call the optimum pH range where it's working. And so you as a brewer, for example, or whoever is using enzymes, what you want to do is get the right condition for the enzyme to get the most out of it. And that's, as you can see, by adjusting the pH level, but it's also especially by adjusting the temperature level. So usually you have a kind of a narrow range where enzymes work most active, and before at lower temperatures they are not as active, and at higher temperatures there's a risk that they will denature. That means they will kind of be inactivated, not work at all anymore. And the job of in this case of us brewers, is to give the right conditions to the enzyme to make the best performance. But let's jump now into specifically brewing, and I've mentioned brewing already a few times, and what enzymes do in brewing. I mean, we all know that enzymes are being expressed during the malting process, and they are needed for the degradation of these macromolecules. The most important one is starch that needs to be kind of broken down into fermentable sugars, so we can start the alcoholic fermentation. I usually like to kind of take a step back and look in history what actually happened in brewing and how this whole process has evolved. And I think brewing is just a fantastic example because it's like the oldest biotechnological process we have in the world. So not we, but historians think that the brewing process is started around 2000 before 2000 BC, and the origin is expected to have started at what they call the Fertile Half Moon, and that's the area what's today Egypt, Israel, Syria, Iran, Iraq, over here. And that was a very fertile area, and as people settled down and started to grow plants and fruits and so on. And then soon they started to kind of brew beer. But how did they do this? There's, of course, you had the fruits available. I mean, starting a fermentation with fruits is rather simple because it already contains fermentable sugars like fructose or glucose. So you just add a microorganism, or the yeast is coming by itself, and it starts the alcoholic fermentation. In the brewing, it's a little bit more difficult because you need to break down the starch, and that's the biotechnological aspect of brewing. And in order to do this, you needed to start, to make enzymes. And the people there already found out how to do this by malting the grains. So by first by germinating the grains they were using, and then kilning, and then using for the brewing process. So it's a very old process, and that's more than 12,000 years that people already use enzymes for their purposes. Other areas where this technology or enzymes have been used for a long time is, for example, also the cheese making, where enzymes have been utilized. Then, of course, so back then, scientists expect that it was kind of a mixture. People were using grains, people were using fruits as a combination. Of course, water was already part of it. They needed for mashing. Yeast, of course, was always there. They didn't add it by themselves, but I mean, it was just on the fruits, for example, and you got the fermentation. Then if you look back about 4,000 years, it was kind of the first step when brewing became industrialized. And that was in Egypt. And we can see in old writings or in paintings in Egypt that there was a baking process and a brewing process going in parallel. So it was already very well known how to produce beer in big quantities. So people there already knew exactly how malting process was working and how to kind of break down the starch. So they probably didn't know what enzymes are, but they knew exactly how to produce enzymes back then. Then if you take a step during the last 1,000 years, that's when, the monasteries in Europe became kind of the headquarters for brewing. And they pretty quickly found out that hops is kind of the perfect ingredient in brewing. So before hops wasn't used, there were all kind of different ingredients used to spice the beer and give it a certain taste. But then they found out that hops is kind of perfectly, the perfect ingredient for brewing. Then one, I would say, important step was in 1516, and that was the declaration of the German purity law, the Reinheitsgebot. And here it was the first time, it's the oldest still existing food law. And here it was written that for brewing beer, it should be used barley. And they probably meant barley malt because you cannot brew just with barley back then, hops and water. And of course, apparently they needed yeast as well, but it wasn't detected or discovered until the 19th century by Louis Pasteur. So that's kind of the time when we found the 4 main ingredients. If you then look in the 19th century, I mean, besides exploring that there's yeast also part of the brewing process, that became when the industrial brewing became big. So you saw all over the world kind of this pop up of these big industrial brewing plants. So I mentioned that the enzyme from the beginning, so the last at least 12,000 years, were quite important for the brewing process. And the people adapted to it and found good ways in making malt, making year-on-year better quality malt to get more out of the yield, getting more enzyme activity. But then they also kind of discovered the best way of brewing the beer. And as I mentioned before, in order to get the enzyme to work, you kind of need to play with the circumstances. That means especially the pH level and the temperature range the enzymes are working. And over the centuries, and especially the last 200 years, there were kind of clear guidelines, also from brewing schools, that developed on how to brew beer. So at which temperature you need to have a rest to make the enzyme to work, to break down these big molecules. And I want to give you a few examples. And I know that's kind of a big table, but I want to show you what the enzymes in malt, so the endogenous enzyme, where they work and how, I mean, the brewers over the last 150, 200 years really made it, kind of got the best out of it. And first, usually they started with a rest at between 40 and 50 degrees. And that's where the endobeta-glucanase is working. That means at this temperature, you had an endogenous enzyme that were breaking down the beta-glucans in your mash that made it possible later on to easily filter your wort and also the beer. So you had your first rest. Then typically, brewers were heating up to temperatures around 50 degrees. And that's where the proteases kind of have their optimum temperature. So you would keep a rest here to break down the proteins into smaller peptides and free amino acids. And these free amino acids were needed for yeast food during fermentation. So to get a good fermentation, you needed enough FAN. Then typically you would have a rest just above gelatinization temperature. So the moment when the starch is kind of opening up for enzymes and for water. And at this temperature, you had the beta amylase working. So typically you would have it rest at around 62 to 65 degrees. And that's where the starch was broken down into maltose. And simultaneously, the starch was broken down in oligosaccharides like dextrins. And then you would go up in temperature, typically somewhere around 80 degrees, 78 to 80 degrees, because that's a temperature where the alpha amylase was still working. But you had kind of the lowest possible viscosity, and you got a good filtration process of the bird. But there was one limitation. I mean, there's actually quite a lot of process limitations, as you can hear. I mean, brewers adopted very nicely to this kind of different step meshing. However, you were always bound to step meshing because of these limitations of the enzymes. So you cannot degrade beta-glucans at 60 degrees. You cannot degrade proteins at 70 degrees. And you cannot degrade starch at 90 degrees, for example. So you couldn't just run the process you wanted, and that might be the best in order to save energy, the fastest, or to process any kind of raw material. Now you are really bound to this endogenous malt parameters. And that's a process limitation. And that's where we as company, as Novozymes, for example, come into play. So if you look at the goal of meshing itself, we have two goals. Number one is solubilizing the key malt or any adjunct constituents. That could be sugar, starch, amino acids, peptides, and proteins. And then second one is hydrolyzing these high molecular components into fermentable molecules. So the most important, of course, we want to break down starch and dextrins into fermentable sugars. But then, of course, as mentioned before, we, for example, also need FAN, and we need the degradation of the beta-glucan in order to make it easy processable. And in the past, that worked very nicely with the malt endogenous enzymes, and it still works very nicely. However, you have these limitations, as I just mentioned. So again, that's where we come into place, where we sell enzymes that are specifically found in nature or designed to fit your brewing process. So you are completely flexible, for example, on the pH level, if you want. You can be flexible on the temperature level. You can be flexible on the amount of enzymes you want to add to kind of speed up your process or slow down your process. And that gives you three benefits. It's process efficiency. It's by, for example, improved planning reliability, because no matter how the quality of your malt is, you always have enough alpha amylase activity to break down your starch. You can reduce your losses because the enzymes are active for a longer time. So, for example, during the whole mash-off process. So you're really degrading all of the starch. You're not losing any starch in the spent grains. And you also get increased flexibility on other raw materials, so type and quality. So you don't want to brew with malt or barley. You want to brew with rye or oat, no problem. You can use it as adjunct or malted, doesn't matter. The missing enzymes can be added from the outside. Then there's space for innovation, and that's kind of overlapping. So you're not bound to the traditional raw material, which is barley. And I mean, barley is a fantastic raw material. And there's a reason why it has been grown for so many years or centuries and used for brewing, because it has the kind of the perfect mixture of enzymatic activity, but also of spent grains or of the husk to starch and protein ratio to kind of make beer. And it's kind of the perfect raw material. But maybe you're looking for something else. Maybe you want to kind of have a drier beer and you want to brew with maize or rice. You want to do something completely crazy and go with rye, which is super viscous. It was possible, but very difficult in the past. And with enzymes, I mean, you can just do it. You can enhance or reduce the concentration of the components. I mean, it's possible at brewing, for example, super high gravity, just as example. And then there's a very important topic, and I think it becomes, from year to year even more important, and that's the sustainability. Using enzyme, and by simplifying, for example, the mashing process itself, you can reduce the water consumption, you can reduce the energy consumption and the CO2 emissions. And besides the sustainability impact, it's also a question of price. I mean, we see energy prices going up. It's a very nice way on saving and contributing at the same time on the sustainability targets. Something we've been working also a lot is working with locally grown raw material. And just giving you an example is, in the past, a lot of the raw material for brewing in Africa was imported, for example, from Europe or Australia. Nowadays, we are really focusing on, and governments in Africa, for example, are focusing on using locally grown raw materials. So where are enzymes being added? So if you use enzymes, they're usually added in the mash vessel or the cereal cooker, depending on what you want to do. Of course, if you want to brew with high gelatinizing raw material like rice or maize, you add the enzymes in the cereal cooker. If you do a traditional infusion mashing, you add the enzymes in the mash tun. Very simple, just during mashing, you add the enzymes and they're performing very nicely. There's a very few enzymes that are added downstream during fermentation, but that's kind of more an exception than the standard. Now let's look at some very specific issues you might face. And I mean, we called this session talk about bad weather. And for me, just looking back the last, let's say, 5 to 6 years, the years with bad quality barley and consequently low quality malt was kind of more than the years where we had good quality. And these years they're leading to lower throughput. You usually see an increase in haze, but also the material costs are increasing. That means in order to get good quality and a good processability of your beer, you need to invest more in raw material for the good quality. So it's there's scarcity out there. And it has become, over the last few years, really challenging. And I would like to walk you through step by step what we would advise if you kind of face the issue of low quality barley or low quality malt. So starting with the impact on, the weather impact on brewing and the impact on raw material quality. Now, what you will first probably face is a high protein content. So typically, if we are talking about protein in malt, we are looking about something like 11 to 12%. So to get enough protein for yeast food as FAN, but also enough protein for nice foam on top of the beer. In recent years, I've seen, that the specification of a lot of breweries had to be increased to like 12, 13, and up to 14% because they couldn't get anything else. They had to get these high protein content malts. And if you increase the protein content by 2%, that at the same time means that the starch content in your malt is reduced by 2%. So you're getting less out of your malt or your barley. So you're losing in the end in beer volume. At the same time, you also face a lot of difficulties. So if we look at the barley and the malting process, if you use barley, I mean low quality barley in the malt house, you will see it's harder to malt. Harder to malt means it's also more energy intense. You might need to intensify the germination process, the steeping process, and you might also see increased extract losses out of this. So the malting process is definitely negatively impacted. But having this impact on the malting process, you still don't have super quality malt, because you can, if you want to make good malt, you need good barley quality. If you do not have good barley quality, you will not get good malt. That also has its impact on the brewery itself. And I just mentioned it. You will see with the high protein content, you will see extract losses, so per ton of grist. You will most likely see filtration issues, and that's not just the final beer filtration, but especially also during mash off. So no matter if you have a mash filter or a laudanum, you will probably see that the proteins will block the filter more likely, and consequently also having haze and turbidity issues in the beer. So what can you do? So in the case of high protein contents and filtration and haze issues, what you can do is you can intensify the protein rest. So typically you have 50 to 52 degrees. You have your protein rest to generate FAN. And if you have high protein contents, you can intensify it. In order to boost this additionally, you can use enzymes. And the enzyme I would kind of advise you to use, that's Fun Boost Pro. So as the name already mentions, it's generating FAN, free amino nitrogen, and is added right at the beginning of the process. Additionally, I would also recommend using Ultraflow Max. And Ultraflow Max is breaking down the beta-glucans and arabinosilans, so these hemicelluloses in your malt. What it does is it kind of supports your filtration process. So it's considering that you will probably face more difficulties in lautering or mash filtration. Using a beta-glucanase at least takes the pressure on the beta-glucan blocking the filter. So it's kind of at least managing all the other issues that could occur during lautering. I mentioned before there's also possible extract losses, but I mean that's something enzymes cannot do, because if there's less starch in the grain, it's just less. So in this case, you need to focus on what you can do, and that's looking at the filtration issues, and that can be done by protein breakdown and kind of supporting the hemicellulose breakdown with, for example, Ultraflow Max. I just mentioned there is the possibility, I mean, you will see a loss in extract or less extract in there, and you cannot make up for the extract. I mean, if it's not in the kernel, you will not get it in the wort. However, what you need to do is making sure that the extract is broken down to the maximum. That means you don't want to lose additionally extract in your spent grains, so extractable extract or washable extract. And what you can do here is, on top of a filtration solution, Ultraflow Max, you can also use an alpha amylase, a thermostable one. And the solution I would recommend here is Ceramix Flex. And Ceramix Flex has two very nice features. Number one, it's a thermostable alpha amylase, so it's working throughout the whole meshing process and even during the mash off process in your laudanum or your mash filter, and breaking down all of the remaining starch. So as soon as the starch is broken down, of course, you will notice by a negative iodine test, it can be washed out much more easily in your kettle. So you're not losing this extract. Another possibility of using Ceramix Flex, and that's a side effect, you can switch from a decoction process, as shown here, into an infusion process. That's a little bit a different topic, but still it has a very kind of a lot of potential usages in the brewery. Additionally, I'm always advising Ultraflow Max because it's lowering the viscosity in any way. So the starch that has been broken down into fermentable sugars or dextrins can also be washed out much more easily out of your spent grains. So you're really reducing your losses. Another point that might occur with this low quality malt, and especially in recent years, that's an increase of the small kernels and also an increase of the gelatinization temperature. What it means, So the gelatinization temperature is the temperature when the starch kernels, the starch granules in your kernel, kind of open up for your for the water. So that's when they kind of start to swell. The water is getting into the starch. You will notice it by a viscosity increase of your mesh, and at the same time, with the water, all the enzymes can kind of go into the starch and break it down. So as soon as the enzymes enter, you will see again viscosity reduction by breaking down the starch. With these recent developments, we have seen broadly that the temperature for this gelatinization temperature has increased. So in the past, you would see at barley and also in malt temperature between 62 to maybe 64 degrees centigrade of gelatinization. That means at this temperature, the enzyme could enter the malt and break down into fermentable sugars. And that worked nicely, because if we look down here, that's the malt endogenous enzymes. The beta amylase would work perfectly in these conditions, and also the alpha amylase would work in these conditions. However, with this increased temperatures during summer and the droughts, we see that the gelatinization temperature is going up. And in recent years, I've seen 66 degrees, 67 degrees centigrade and up. And that means that the alpha amylase, the beta amylase is more or less knocked out at these temperatures and cannot work anymore. And what you will see is extract losses and lower fermentability of your beers. So to sum up, barley usually somewhere between 60 and 65 degrees centigrade, malt about the same, wheat the same. Then you have these high gelatinizing raw materials like maize, rice, sorghum, cassava, where you traditionally would run a decoction process to kind of pre-gelatinize. But recently, that has become also an option if you want to brew with barley. However, that's kind of when you go with the traditional way of only the endogenous enzymes from the malt. Our solution here is using a thermostable glucanase, amyloglucosidase, and that product would be a Tenusan Pro. So it's a combination of an enzyme that's breaking down dextrins into fermentable sugars, mainly glucose, and an enzyme, pulnase, which is breaking down the 1,6 linkages in amylopectin very efficiently. And again, for this enzyme, you add it during mash-in, and you just keep a saccharification rest that's just above gelatinization temperature. So if gelatinization temperature of your malt is 66 degrees, you just have a rest at around 66 to 67 degrees, and the enzyme will nicely break down your dextrins into the fermentable sugars, and you will not see any losses in dextrins, or you will not see any impact on your fermentability of the final beer. Yeah, that's kind of explaining what the enzyme does. So I'm talking about Tenusan Pro. That's the product name. And what it does, it's a combination of the glucoamylase, which is kind of from the non-reducing end of the amylopectin and amylose chain, cleaving glucose molecules, so providing glucose for fermentation. At the same time, the pullulinase is kind of cutting down the 1,6 linkages in amylopectin, so providing more of these chains, so the enzymes can more efficiently work on it, and that's providing you kind of with a sufficient amount of fermentable sugars to deal with high gelatinizing raw materials. This slide is kind of the summary what you can do, and I will quickly run through it. So if you have a low quality barley or low quality malt available for brewing, you will face kind of three main challenges. Number one is a high protein content. And in this case, protein means turbidity and filtration issues. What you need to do is you need to cut down these protein levels during mashing. And that can be by an extending of the protein rest, or additionally, by an addition of a protease, and that would be FanBoost Pro. Secondly, you could also use on top a filtration enzyme that's at least taking the pressure of your mash filtration and beer, mash separation or beer filtration, because it's lowering the viscosity of your mash and beer. The second challenge you can face, or you might change, is less starch. That's just because of the higher protein content, you have less starch available. And the solution you should apply here is a thermostable alpha malase, and that would be Ceramix Flex, which makes sure that you will not leave any starch in your spent grains. So really degrading all of the starch that's available and wash it out. So you're not losing any more of the extract available. And the last point, that's the challenge with small kernels and the increased gelatinization temperature. And here, what you need to do is you need to apply an enzyme that's working at conditions above this gelatinization temperature. And the bitter truth is we have seen these increased temperatures, and the beta amylase in malt was just quickly denaturing, and you need to kind of add enzymes in order to still get the same fermentability of your beers. That much about the weather impact and the quality of the raw materials we have seen in recent years. Something that goes, that's, I would say, very important topic nowadays, and it has increased over the last few weeks and months. That's trends we have seen globally on the malting price itself, the barley price itself, and also the energy prices going up globally. And what we see, there's two graphs of it. We see that the prices for malting barley are on the highest level since 40 years. And also the stock of barley available, and that's globally, are also as low as not in the last 40 years. And again, that puts a lot of pressure on breweries of kind of sourcing, getting barley, but also then getting good quality of barley for malting. And that kind of is reflected in what I've just talked before, what you can do when you get less quality barley malt for brewing. And the second one, what we see is the increase in energy prices. So crude oil and natural gas prices are just exploding during the last few weeks. And I want to show you a few ideas what you can do by utilizing enzymes in kind of reducing the energy consumption in your brewery in order to kind of take a little bit pressure from the cost, but also eventually doing something good for the environment and on your sustainability impact. So number one, what I would like to show you is a few ideas that you could use. You could save time and energy when you use Ceramix Flex. And you learned about Ceramix Flex before. It's a thermostable alpha amylase that can be applied in a normal infusion meshing process to kind of get more starch out of your spent grains. But it also allows you to brew at high gelatinizing raw materials in an infusion process. Because what it does, it makes it possible to access starch at below its gelatinization temperature. That means if you're brewing, for example, with maize or rice, you would typically run a decoction process, meaning you would heat up the maize or rice to 90 to 100 degrees to gelatinize the raw material, and then you would blend it with the main mash, where the enzymes will work to kind of break down into fermentable sugars. With Ceramix Flex, that's not necessary. You can just run in a normal infusion process. It just needs to be adjusted a little bit by extending the time at around about 80 degrees, so it can really degrade all of the starch. But it's working very nicely, and what you will see is you will save the boiling time up here. You will save the temperature. You don't need to go to 100 degrees, and you will save in total time for the meshing process. And that's you will later see in savings in energy in the process. Another possibility, what you could do is you could simplify your meshing process. And I've put up here, two examples. And that's kind of, it's a little bit provocative, but it's just want to kind of trigger a few ideas what you can do. What you see here is a typical meshing profile. That's what I said in the beginning. You have a protein rest, saccharification, a beta-glucan rest, a protein rest, saccharification rest, and then you have kind of the mash off where the alpha amylase is still working. And that's because the enzymes need these rests to work in their best conditions. Now, if you have the possibility of applying enzymes that work in kind of all conditions, so then you're not limited to this process flow. You could eventually run a very simplified process, like with only 2 rests, or maybe even with an isothermal meshing, so at 1 temperature, meshing in at, let's say, 75 degrees and just keeping it 75 degrees centigrade. That would, simplify the process. So you would save a lot of time, but it will also have a direct impact on the temperature and the energy savings you have, because you have the possibility to adjust the meshing profile to your energy balance in your brewery. And that means you can reduce the amount of fresh water being consumed in the process. So that's from a report that was published in 2014 in Brauwelt International by an engineering office from Jaap Rieselader. And he could show that by increasing the meshing temperature, you could steadily reduce the amount of fresh water being consumed in the brewery. At the same time, you could also reduce the amount of thermal energy being used. So, for example, gas being used for heating. And that's by kind of getting the best, or by adjusting perfectly the energy balance in your brewery. With the enzymes we would recommend here, and the enzyme is called Ultraflow Prime. It's our kind of latest enzyme we have brought out, which is a thermostable beta-glucanase, an arabinosylanase. You could also see that with the superior filtration performance, you could see higher throughput in the beer filtration, but also lower Kieselguhr consumption. And at the same time, it's also, of course, better at the mash filtration or the lautering process. And that's resulting, again, in a lower water usage and in energy reduction, just because you have a better filter performance. Lastly, I want to show you kind of another approach. It's already a few years on the market from Novozymes, but it's a process where you can save a lot of energy. And I know I might probably not talking to kind of to the maltsters. I guess there's a lot of brewers, especially in this call, but there's a possibility by avoiding the malting process and using barley straight away in your brewery. And I guess you can imagine, or you know how much energy the malting process itself requires. I mean, you have process like steeping, germination, where you need to keep steady temperatures. And then you have, of course, the kilning process, where you need a lot of temperature to kind of reduce the moisture of the grain to make it usable in the brewing process. What we have designed a few years ago is an enzyme cocktail, enzyme blend, that contains all the necessary enzymes that are not present in barley, brewing barley, in order to process a normal beer. So it means if you use barley just from the field next to you, for example, it contains already enzymes, even in an unmalted process. However, it's just small quantities and not all the right enzymes you require. On the Pro, our product kind of adds all the enzymes on top that's required for a good beer process in the end. So you can completely avoid the malting process in between, and that makes you able to save a lot of energy in the end, water and energy. Of course, there's also a little bit of impact in the brewing process where you might need a little bit more energy, because the milling will take a little bit more energy because it's harder to crush the barley than the barley malt, and the mashing process needs to be a little bit intensified. But in the end, you could say you're increasing the mashing time by like 30 minutes, but you're saving like 1 week of malting process, where you need to kind of invest a lot of energy. In the end, you will get a beer that, and when it was introduced, I mean, we did a lot of studies on it. That was perfectly okay with flavor and stability. And depending on kind of the ratio, how much barley you use and how much, for example, specialty malts you can use, you can still adjust your the beer flavor you want to achieve, and also the beer style. So there's still full flexibility, but with a very nice advantage of having a much lower CO2 footprint on the planet. And I mean, sometimes you could claim that you used local barley and saved a lot of energy during the process. So to sum this one up, if you want to reduce the energy pressure on your brewery, there's a few opportunities. The first one I talked about is avoiding the cereal cooker with our product Ceramics Flex, which makes it possible to process high gelatinizing raw material in an infusion process. Secondly, there's a possibility of simplifying your mesh profile. And just as an example, I mentioned Ultraflow Prime, which is our latest filtration enzyme that makes it possible to kind of using enzymes at the conditions you kind of decide from an energy perspective. So if your energy balance tells you, I need to mesh at 65 degrees, the enzymes will not be the barrier. You will find the right enzyme solutions from Novozymes to brew at this temperature without any negative side effects down the road. And lastly, that's the possibility of using an enzyme mix on their Pro to avoid the full malt house process to save energy and water in the full life cycle of the beer and the full value chain of producing beer. Having this said, we are coming to an end. And I, first of all, want to thank you for paying attention to this presentation and for your curiosity about enzymes, exogenous enzymes in the brewing process. And of course, I will be free now to answer some questions that have been popped up, but also want to kind of underline again, if there's later on, you're looking for a contact either in North America, then you can reach out to my colleague Dirk in the US. Or if you're from Europe or you want to reach out to Europe, I have a colleague here. It's Alexander Zune in Denmark. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Alex. Lots of great information there. Doesn't look like we have any questions yet, but we do have a few minutes left. So if you have a question, please go ahead and add it to that Ask a Question area, and we will address that as soon as possible. We did have one of our attendees, Eduardo, looking for information on getting your products in Mexico City. It looks like your colleague Mark has already addressed that, though. Mm-hmm. So we'll just give it a few minutes here. Alex, I don't know if there's any, like frequently asked questions that you get from folks about the enzymes that you want to kind of touch on here while we're waiting to see if anyone has any other questions. But now might be a time for any of those things to touch on.
Yeah, I mean, I think one helpful information I just want to underline it, the usage of enzymes is super easy. So you get the enzymes in a liquid form when you order it, and it's just added during the meshing process. So it's easy applied. The dosages, I mean, are quite low, so handling is super easy, and you will instantly see the results. So if it's by increasing your FAN content, you will see it right away. Filtration process you can improve using, for example, Ultraflow Max, and you will see it during the malting process, during the mesh filter process right away. So if you're not sure if you want to try enzymes, I would say give it a go. We have super good colleagues in US who can support you in giving it a try. And also with the implementation, with the application, they will support you. There's videos online. And I'm pretty sure you will see the benefit right away during the process.
We did have one question come in from Dilo asking if your products are allowed in organic brewing.
That's a good question, yes. So we do have products that can be used in organic production. Of course, I have to say, I'm sitting here in Europe. It always depends a little bit on the legislation and kind of what you want to fit, which kind of certification. That's not when I'm an expert, but I have my colleagues in the US who can answer this. But generally, you can differentiate between there's enzymes coming from genetically modified organisms, and then there's enzymes coming from genetically non-changed organisms. Enzymes itself are never genetically modified. It might be the organism. If you want to brew organically, you need to have enzymes from that are non-changed organisms, and that's something we have also in our portfolio. But for this one, if you have these specific questions and you need specific products, I think that's best to reach out to my colleagues, and they will kind of guide you to the right product. So in principle, it's possible, yes.
Great. We had another couple questions come in. This one from Drew. He's asking, what products would you recommend for mashing with rye malt? Even with the beta-glucanase rest, it's still very slow lautering.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. The rye doesn't contain, well, it does contain, of course, beta-glucan, but the reason why you see this really heavy increase in viscosity, that's mainly due to the arabinosilans, so the silans and pentosans in rye. And since malt doesn't have silane activity or good silane activity itself, you need to add one. So the solution here and the product I would recommend, that's Ultraflow Max, because it's a combination of a beta-glucanase and an arabinosilanase. And I'm pretty sure it will work. I mean, we have seen, and we have, I think, also video online where it's showing the difference between rye malt filtering and a mesh with Ultraflow Max, and it's a significant difference, and it's possible, yes.
Great. We had one other question come in the chat. Christopher's asking where you can request samples of your enzymes. It's the best process for that.
Yeah, so the best process would be, I mean, you can go on the website, and you can order there, and then of course reaching out to my colleagues. So I guess you are probably in North America. In this case, reaching out to my colleague Dilek, who is located in US, and she will guide you further.
Great. That's our last question as of right now. So I'm going to take a minute just to thank you, Alex, for the presentation today. Lots of great information there, and Enzymes for the sponsorship of this collab hour. Remind everyone that the slides from the presentation today are available at that green button at the bottom of your screen. We're also recording it so that it'll be available shortly after we wrap up at the very same link or archived on the Brewers Association website. I just got a question here from Casey asking, what type of products and mash schedule do you suggest for gluten-free brewing?
Yeah, also very good question. And so our approach on gluten-free is avoiding raw materials that contain gluten at all. So raw materials like maize, rice, but also sorghum, for example, and you can make fantastic beers, for example, with sorghum. We have the right enzymatic solutions to process these raw materials, and you're not even getting into the risk of having any gluten in your beer. And we do have a lot of experience here. And again, I mean, I guess that would require a presentation itself, kind of going through the different steps and requirements of processing these kind of raw materials. Best would be reaching out. We have colleagues who have been working with gluten-free beers quite a lot in recent time, and they can give you kind of the right enzymatic solution, of course. It depends a little bit on what kind of raw materials you want to use, and help you also kind of on how to make the process right. So what kind of meshing profile you need to drive in order to get the most out of it, and the right brand, the right style out of it. So again, reaching out to my colleagues, and they can really guide you through step by step.
Great. Thanks, Alex. It looks like that's our last question. If we do have questions come in after the fact, we can certainly shoot those your way, Alex. We can address those back for folks. But that's about it today. Again, thank you to Alex and Enzymes for today's presentation. Thanks for everyone for signing in to check out today's collab hour. Alex, anything else to add before we wrap up for today?
I'm just happy that I could present. So it was a real pleasure to talk about these topics, and I think they are relevant. And looking forward for some feedback and some interest in our enzymes. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you on the next Collab Hour.